It was one of those heavy, humid nights that seemed to stretch on, the air thick and laced with nostalgia. We were gathered in an old, dimly lit restaurant for our alumni reunion, where the scent of bourbon and spice mingled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. People were swapping old memories and sharing shallow laughs, the usual small talk you expect at these types of gatherings. At first, it was all just light-hearted chatter, but then I noticed her, Mira, and she wasn't alone. I tried to ignore it, but there he was, Dylan, her old high school flame. I'd heard stories about him, but I'd always dismissed them as silly memories. Yet here he was, taller, broader, and wearing that cocky grin that made it clear he knew exactly how he looked. And he was laying it on thick, like he thought he still had a hold on her. When I saw Myra's face light up, I felt a pang I hadn't felt in a long time. She looked almost giddy, younger somehow, like she hadn't looked with me in years. They started talking, oblivious to everyone else. I watched them, feeling a knot of anger and confusion tighten in my gut as they laughed and swapped memories, acting like the time between them had vanished. I caught bits of his words, compliments like, "You haven't changed a bit," and "Remember those wild weekends?" He was treating it like some romantic comedy reunion, and Mira was soaking it up. That look she had, the one I'd seen when we first got together, before things got complicated, hit me hard, and I knew this night was going to change something. After a while, I went over, trying to act normal. But when I said hello, Mira barely looked my way, focused completely on Dylan. I tried to laugh it off, but Dylan just had this smug look on his face, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Eventually, I walked away, feeling like an outsider in my own life. That night was only the beginning. After the reunion, things started to change. Mira began dressing differently, putting effort into her appearance in a way she hadn't in years. She'd always been attractive, but now it was like she was preparing for some big show every time she left the house. New clothes, haircuts, makeup, even perfume. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, laughing like I was being ridiculous. But there was something off, something I couldn't shake. And then her friend Sabrina got involved. She'd always been a close friend, someone we trusted, but now she seemed a little too pleased with Myra's new energy. She'd laugh about it with me, calling it Myra's second wind, like it was all just some harmless fun. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. One night, I saw Mira texting someone late at night, her face lit up by her phone under the covers. I asked her casually, "Who's texting you so late?" "Oh, it's just Sabrina," she replied, sounding too casual. "She's dealing with some family drama." I nodded, but a doubt settled in. Soon, Mira was going out more and more, always claiming she was catching up with friends or needing me time. Whenever I'd ask, "You meeting up with anyone?" she'd wave me off with a sweet smile, saying, "Just some girlfriends. Don't worry." Then Sabrina came by one evening, and there was an odd tension in the air. She looked at me with a mix of concern and pity before finally asking, "Hey, have you noticed anything different with Mira?" I hesitated, but finally admitted, "Yeah, something feels off." Sabrina nodded slowly. "Just keep an eye on things, all right? If you need anything, I'm here." Her words hung there, unspoken but heavy, like a warning. That night, a red flag waved in my mind, and I started noticing every little thing Mira probably thought I'd ignore. There were strange numbers showing up on our phone bill, late-night calls she dismissed as just catching up with Sabrina. But her voice was always hushed, too careful, too secretive. Each night, it felt like I was waiting for a bomb to go off. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away from me, slowly but surely. I wasn't about to let her tear apart everything we'd built together, not without a fight. At first, I tried telling myself she was going through a phase, maybe dealing with something personal. But it was clear that a wall was going up between us, brick by brick. She was always on her phone, always finding reasons to be out in the evenings, girls' nights, or just time for herself. She'd say it with that sweet smile, the one that used to make me melt, but now it felt hollow, like it was hiding something. Each time she'd step out, that chill in my gut got stronger. One evening, I heard her phone ring, and she looked at me quickly before slipping out to the balcony. I could hear just bits of her conversation through the door. I heard her say, "Yes, I miss you," in a soft, low voice, and then, "We can meet." Those words hit me hard, jealousy burning through me. I tried to calm down, tell myself it wasn't what it sounded like, but the pieces were starting to add up. After she ended the call, she came back inside, her face a calm mask. She gave me that same smile and said, "Just Sabrina again. She's having a hard time." I nodded, but every word felt like a lie. I didn't know if I should confront her or hope she'd come clean on her own. But each time I looked into her eyes, searching for the truth, she'd pull back behind that practiced smile. A couple of days later, I went out with some friends from work to a bar that smelled faintly of old wood and stale beer. We usually laughed about our days, but that night I couldn't keep up the charade. Logan, a friend of mine, noticed and asked, "All right, man, what's going on? You've been off all night." I tried to laugh it off, but there was no point anymore. "It's Mira," I admitted. "She's distant, always on her phone, going out constantly, brushing me off when I ask." Logan gave me a look of concern. "Think there's someone else?" The words stung, making me face a fear I was trying to avoid. "I don't know," I said, but even to myself it sounded like an excuse. Logan leaned in, his voice low. "Look, I hope I'm wrong, but if something's up, don't ignore it. Keep an eye out. Let me know if you need help." His words stayed with me, and as strange as it felt to think about that level of caution, I knew he was right. If I wanted answers, I couldn't just wait. That weekend, I tried to set everything aside, suggesting we go out for dinner. I wanted to have a night just for us, to reconnect, or at least figure out what was going on. She agreed, but even at the restaurant, her mind was somewhere else. She kept checking her phone, glancing around like she was waiting for someone. I tried to make conversation, but she gave short answers, her attention constantly drifting back to her phone. When she excused herself to the restroom, I picked up her phone, hoping to find something that would make sense of it all. But, of course, it was locked and she'd put a new code on it. I set it down just in time before she came back, giving me that same empty smile. I could feel myself starting to detach, the numbness settling in as a way to protect myself. But I wasn't about to give up on our life just yet. A few days later, my curiosity got the best of me, and I gave in to snooping. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. When Mira wasn't home, I went through her laptop and found something I wasn't expecting. A hidden social media profile under a name I'd never heard her use. She'd been messaging Dylan. Late-night threads, packed with exchanges that stretched back for who knows how long. That was all the confirmation I needed. She'd been hiding this whole relationship behind a fake name, keeping me totally in the dark. I'd only skimmed the surface, but I saw enough. Their words, her laughter, their shared secrets, all of it built on lies and deceit. It wasn't even like they were trying to hide it well. It felt like they assumed I'd never suspect a thing, that I'd never believe my own wife was capable of this. Reading their messages, seeing the way she spoke to him with a warmth I hadn't felt in years, made me feel like a complete fool. More than once, I wanted to smash the laptop, to shove it all in her face and confront her. But something held me back. Maybe I needed a plan, or maybe I wanted to know the full extent of her betrayal before putting everything on the line. There was no denying it now. I had been watching our marriage fade little by little, but this was a slap in the face. Proof that she had completely disregarded everything we'd built together. And the worst part was, she was so wrapped up in it, she didn't even notice that I was catching on. So I waited. I watched. Each time she disappeared for a girls' night, or slipped outside for a whispered call, I reminded myself that my patience wouldn't last forever. Not long after, I arranged to meet with Sabrina at a small cafe tucked away from the busy streets. It felt strange, calling her just to talk about Mira, but I needed someone who might understand. She'd been close to both of us for years, and she was one of the few people I could trust to be honest. The moment she sat down, I could see the mixture of sympathy and anger in her eyes. Sabrina had always been more loyal to me than to Mira, and now that loyalty showed. I laid it all out. The lies, the girls' nights that weren't, the quiet moments when Mira would slip away with her phone. Sabrina's expression tightened as she listened. She didn't hold back, openly calling Mira out for being selfish and cowardly. Hearing someone else say it out loud hit me hard. There was a tension between us, a charged silence that felt unfamiliar. I didn't expect it, but at that moment, anger and betrayal stirred up something else entirely. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, her touch warm and steady. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me like that, with genuine care. It felt strange, even wrong, but there was something real in her eyes. It was a temptation, a challenge, a reminder that maybe I hadn't lost everything. We both knew where this was going, and by that night, one thing led to another. We ended up in bed together. I can't describe the satisfaction I felt. Not just from the act itself, but from knowing I wasn't as naive as Mira thought I was. After that, everything shifted. Sabrina and I became allies, two people with a shared goal, each one feeding off the other's energy. She wanted to see Mira get what she deserved just as much as I did, and she wasn't afraid to help me make it happen. Together, we pieced together a plan, figuring out the best way to expose Myra's lies and make sure she'd realize exactly what she was losing. We started meeting more often, sometimes in public, sometimes at my place, hashing out details and strategizing on how to catch her in a way she couldn't deny. It was Sabrina who suggested we dig into Dylan's life, to see if there was anything about him that might open Myra's eyes to who he really was. If she was choosing him over me, maybe there was something about him that would make her think twice. That's how we found Bart, an old friend of Dylan's from years back. Sabrina had a connection through someone, and before long, I was sitting in a dingy bar with Bart, listening to stories that made my blood boil. Bart was more than willing to share every ugly detail. Turns out, Dylan had a history, stories of manipulation using women to get what he wanted. Bart laughed bitterly as he shared, obviously still resentful about how things had ended between them. The more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. Dylan wasn't some charming old flame. He was a user, and Mira had fallen right into his trap. Bart told me about Dylan's habits, his tricks for getting what he wanted. He'd even bragged to Bart about how easily he could manipulate women into spending money on him, buying him things and paying his way. I felt a hot, simmering anger rise up, a fury I hadn't known before. Sabrina played her part perfectly. She started coming by my place more often, sometimes lingering just long enough that Mira might notice when she came home. We weren't obvious, but Sabrina would leave small traces. A scarf here, a lipstick on the counter there. Just enough for Mira to start noticing. And it worked. I saw it in her eyes, a flicker of doubt she tried to hide, a hint of jealousy she wasn't ready to admit. I wanted her to feel that same twist of betrayal that had become my constant companion. Sabrina and I met up late at night, sometimes just to talk, sometimes for more, and soon the lines between revenge and something real blurred. But every time, it reminded me of what I was fighting for. This wasn't just about Myra's affair anymore. It was about taking back control, proving to myself that I wasn't as broken as she wanted me to believe. We kept meeting with Bart, learning more about Dylan's shady past with each visit. The stories piled up, painting a picture of the kind of man he really was. One story, in particular, stuck with me, how he'd conned an ex-girlfriend into funding a fake business, draining her savings before disappearing. This was the guy Mira was so infatuated with, the man she'd thrown away our life for. Knowing all this gave me a dark sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and soon enough, she'd see him for what he really was. Sabrina was relentless in her role as my partner in crime. She'd drop by with coffee, help run errands, and stick around just long enough for Mira to catch on, just enough to make her uneasy. The thrill of it, watching her squirm a little, seeing that doubt creep into her eyes. It was a taste of payback, a small victory that turned the tables in my favor. In those secret meetings with Bart, as he shared more of Dylan's twisted history, my plan became clear. Mira was going to see the truth whether she liked it or not. Her fantasy world would come crashing down around her, and I'd be there to watch. Then I took a close look at our finances, and everything became glaringly obvious. At first, I didn't want to believe she'd gone so far as to fund her fling with Dylan. But as I went through our bank statements, receipts, and credit card bills, the reality hit me hard. She'd been pouring money into their little affair. Not just on hotels and dinners, but on gifts and even business investments in his name. I found records of wire transfers to his account, payments for whatever scheme he'd roped her into. I couldn't believe she'd been so foolish, draining our savings for a scumbag like him. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. I printed out every piece of evidence, receipts, statements, everything I'd need to show just how deep her betrayal ran. This wasn't some passing affair. She was fully invested in him, mind, body, and bank account. I thought about all the times she'd nagged me about spending, the fights over a few dollars here and there, and here she was, throwing away our money on him. I took everything to Sabrina, the one person who had stood by me through it all. We met at my place, spreading out the evidence on the dining room table like a war map. Sabrina didn't mince words, and neither did I. "It's pathetic, isn't it?" I muttered, glancing over the papers. "How could she do this?" Sabrina shook her head, her jaw tight. "She's blind, Evan. But she doesn't get to just walk away from this. This kind of evidence could destroy her in court." She was right. A week later, we sat across from a lawyer. A shrewd, no-nonsense guy who took his time going through every piece of proof we laid out. He didn't even flinch, just nodded, clearly familiar with cases like ours. By the end, he looked at me and said, "With all this, she won't walk away with a cent. Her credibility is finished." It was exactly what I needed to hear. We moved forward with the divorce, gathering everything we'd need to ensure she left with nothing but her mistakes. But I wasn't just stopping there. I wanted everyone to know the truth, especially her family, who had no idea who she'd become. So I met with her parents. It felt strange sitting in their cozy living room, surrounded by their warmth, knowing the pain I was about to bring. But they deserved to know. I didn't hold back, laying it out. The affair, the money, the lies. They sat in stunned silence, her mother tearing up, her father clenching his jaw as I told them everything. They didn't say much, just absorbed it, faces pale. After that, I noticed they stopped reaching out to her, stopped inviting her over. It was clear where their loyalties lay. With every piece of evidence in place, Sabrina and I made one last, decisive stop, the hotel where Mira had met up with Dylan so many times. We walked in together, acting like just another couple checking in, but we were there for one purpose: the security footage. Sabrina had managed to get us a contact at the hotel, someone willing to bend the rules for a little cash. A few hours later, we walked out holding exactly what we needed. Clear shots of Mira and Dylan together, laughing, holding hands, looking like they didn't have a care in the world. It was the final nail in the coffin, the last piece of proof to ensure her lies couldn't survive being exposed. I could already imagine her face when she realized just how much I knew, how much I'd uncovered. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control again, ready to watch her carefully constructed illusion collapse. As the court date approached, the tension between us grew sharper by the day. Mira tried to act like everything was normal, as if I didn't know what she'd been up to. But now there was a crack in her mask, and she couldn't hold it together as easily as before. Every time I walked into a room, I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a glimmer of realization that her whole world was about to come crashing down. She must have felt the walls closing in on her, the weight of everything she'd carelessly thrown away finally catching up. I counted down the days until I could finally lay it all out in court. But before that, I had one more card to play. I wanted her to understand exactly who she had chosen over me. She'd been living in some fantasy, completely blind to the reality of who Dylan truly was. But that illusion was about to shatter. Sabrina and I had collected everything. Evidence of Dylan's past schemes, his endless string of women, each one just as misled as she had been. I felt a dark satisfaction, knowing she was about to realize the full extent of her betrayal, not just to me but to herself. One night, as she sat across from me, I laid it all out. I told her about Dylan's history, his cons, his manipulations, how he used women for money, gifts, a life he couldn't earn for himself. Her face went pale, the color draining as she took in the truth. I showed her the messages we'd uncovered, the stories Bart had shared, every detail laid bare. She looked sick, her hands shaking as she held the pages. her eyes darting back and forth, searching for a way to deny what was right in front of her. "You thought he loved you?" I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You actually thought you were special? You were just another name on his list, Mira, another wallet to drain." She sat there in stunned silence, unable to respond. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but none came. I watched her, waiting for her to truly grasp the enormity of her mistake. But instead, she shook her head, clinging to her denial like a lifeline. A few days later, desperate, she tried to call Dylan, probably to demand answers, to cling to any remaining hope in her fantasy. But he ignored her calls, her texts, each increasingly frantic attempt to reach him. I watched as her panic grew with each voicemail. Finally, she tracked him down, cornering him at a cafe they'd once frequented. I wasn't there, but from what I heard, it didn't go well. She practically begged him for some explanation, for any reassurance that what they had was real. But he didn't bother with pleasantries. He told her plainly that she was no longer of any interest to him. Without the money, she was useless. He made it clear that she'd just been a pawn, a way to fund his lifestyle, and now that her resources were drained, he was done. I could only imagine the look on her face as he walked out, leaving her alone with the shattered remnants of her own foolishness. She came home late that night, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She barely glanced my way as she walked past, disappearing into the bedroom without a word. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I knew she'd finally seen the truth. In the days that followed, she fell into a silence unlike anything I'd seen before. She'd spend hours just sitting there, staring at the empty walls, the spaces where our family photos had once hung. I'd taken them down, one by one, leaving her nothing to distract herself from the reality of the empty life she'd created. Isolated, abandoned by everyone she'd once known. She had no one left to turn to. Her friends had moved on. Her family wouldn't take her calls. And now even Dylan had discarded her like she was nothing. She was alone, left to face the consequences of her choices. And as much as I'd once loved her, as hard as I'd tried to hold on to the life we'd built, I couldn't find it in myself to feel sorry for her. This was her ending, the final chapter of a story she'd written for herself. She had betrayed me, thrown away everything we'd had, and now she was left with nothing but her own regret. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt like a weight had lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt truly free from the lies, the betrayal, and the twisted mess that Mira had dragged me through. Standing on the other side of it all, I could finally see my life clearly. Sabrina had been by my side through everything, steady and loyal in a way I hadn't expected but had come to rely on. And now, after everything, it felt right to begin a new chapter together. We didn't hide it. After months of quiet revenge and hidden plans, there was no need to tiptoe around anything anymore. Sabrina and I started going out openly, attending events, spending time with friends, enjoying life honestly. Of course, people noticed. The whispers started, speculation buzzing about what had happened between Evan and Mira. People knew something had gone wrong, but they didn't know the whole story. They heard bits and pieces, and naturally the rumors spread. Myra's betrayal became the talk of our social circles, an open secret everyone wanted to understand. And to my surprise, Sabrina and I found ourselves at the center of attention, but in a good way. People saw her as my real partner, the one who had stood by me. It felt like a second chance, a fresh start with someone who actually valued me. There was still one last thing I wanted to do. It wasn't really about revenge anymore, but I wanted to close this chapter in a way that left no doubt about what had happened and who had caused it. I planned a gathering, inviting friends, mutual acquaintances, people who'd been a part of our lives before everything went downhill. I knew Mira would be there. It was the one place she couldn't avoid, the one she couldn't bear to miss, despite knowing what might happen. The night of the gathering, I felt an almost surreal calm. The room was full, and Sabrina stood beside me, a steady presence as I watched curious faces glance our way. When Mira walked in, I saw her face fall. She scanned the room, and I could see the realization in her eyes. She knew she was walking into something she couldn't escape. She tried to smile, tried to hold onto her practiced facade, but it was already slipping. Midway through the evening, I raised my glass, and the room quieted. "Thank you all for being here," I said, letting my voice carry. "Some of you have probably heard rumors, maybe bits and pieces of what's been going on these past months. Tonight, I want to share the truth." I paused, letting the silence deepen as every eye in the room turned to me. Then I began, recounting the story from the first moment I'd suspected something was off, to the final betrayal with Dylan. I held nothing back, letting everyone see the raw truth of what Mira had done. To seal it, I shared the evidence, the photos, the messages, the bank statements. Each revelation landed heavily, and as I spoke, Myra's face went pale, her mouth slightly open as her world unraveled around her. People exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from shock to disgust as the full extent of her betrayal came to light. She tried to speak, stumbling over words, but she was completely overwhelmed. Her usual charm shattered under the weight of her own lies. She sank into a chair, defeated, her head hanging as people murmured around her. The reality of her actions laid bare for everyone to see. For the first time, it seemed like she truly understood the cost of her choices, the life she'd thrown away, and she couldn't bear it. She sat there in her own shame, a hollow version of the person she'd pretended to be. After that night, I felt lighter. I knew that chapter had closed, and nothing was holding me back anymore. I was finally free from the lies, the betrayal, and the resentment that had once clouded my life. Sabrina and I moved forward, embracing our new life together, ready to let go of the past and focus on the future. As I looked around that night at the people who still stood by me and at the woman who had been by my side through it all, I knew I was finally free to live the life I deserved, leaving behind everything that Myra's betrayal had cost me. This was the ending I needed, a clean slate, a fresh start, and a future untainted by the web of lies and deceit.